The following presentation was recorded at the 2025 Southeast Linuxfest in Charlotte, North Carolina. It is licensed under a Creative Commons license. For more information on the Southeast Linuxfest, visit www.southeastlinuxfest.org. Come join us next June.
Thank you for coming to my talk today. My purpose here is to give you facts and some analytical tools to help understand war and conflict in the modern world, what used to be romantically called the Great Game. How many people have seen me give the Ukraine war précis before? Okay, so some of you. In the past few years, I've mostly talked about the Ukraine war. That's not actually the most pressing conflict on the agenda at the moment. Things have cooled down there and are somewhat in stasis. There are three other conflicts right now that are more urgent that we could talk about. I'll try to get a show of hands about what people are most interested in. There's there's the war in Ukraine, of course. There's the potential invasion of Taiwan by the mainland Chinese. Um, and there's the lovely little war that just popped off between Israel and Iran, which is probably the most urgent thing right at the moment. Before I go into any of these, I will explain for the benefit of those of you who haven't seen my talk before, why I'm here and why you should care what I say about such things. I have been studying war and geopolitics from the point of view of a historian and a wargamer for, about 50 years now. That's long enough to learn a few things. Also, I keep track of intelligence sources that don't generally make the US news through a couple of chat channels that I'm on, which I can describe but not name because they're invitational. You have to know someone on them and be invited and agree to certain rules before you can join. But the result is that I have a core of several dozen people who think like intelligence analysts in my pocket on this phone. I was just chatting with them as I was preparing for the talk. One of the channels is basically a news feed for open source intelligence related to all the different wars that are going on, and the other one is a discussion chamber. And the traffic is pretty high quality, so you're not just listening to me, you're listening to stuff that has come through a rather sensitive network of dozens of people who are watching for unusual news sources, open source intelligence, and then sitting down and thinking about it a lot. And now that I've said that, let's find out what the room is primarily interested in. We got three possible topics, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands on each. How many people are primarily interested in the Israel-Iran war right now? All right. How many people are primarily interested in the possible invasion of Taiwan? Okay. And how many people are interested in a briefing on the Ukraine war? Okay, the Ukraine war seems to be losing out. I see about an even split between the people who care about China and the people who care about the new Middle Eastern war. So I'll attempt to cover both of them. We only have an hour, but I can tell you some things that you're not going to learn in the news. And let's start with the Israeli and Iran war. You should all be aware, if you are not, that this is not a new conflict in the sense that Israel and Iran have been at dagger's point ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1980. The Iranians have repeatedly threatened to nuke Israel off the map as soon as they have the capability to do it, and everybody believes them. There's no reason to disbelieve that they will do that. They are motivated by a millenarian version of Islamic theology, which teaches that the destruction of the Jews is necessary to bring about the perfection of God's plan. And they really mean it. And this is why Israel has gone to war, because they pay attention to what Shia Islam says, and they know that they are in real and present danger if the Iranians actually get a nuke. And so, as the Iranians got closer to having a nuke, the probability that in any given week that the Israelis would run an operation like the one we're seeing has been going up asymptotically to unity. The fact that it's happening now tells me that the Israelis think that the time frame for Iranian nuclear capability is down to months rather than years, and they're probably not wrong. They have better intelligence in the region than almost anybody else for obvious reasons. They've got skin in the game. So let's talk about why Iran is so crazy. And then, now I'm going to tell you something you won't hear in the news because it's taboo to even talk about it. There is a fantasy current in certain circles in the US that the US consists of a bunch of enlightened people living in cities and a bunch of sub 80 IQ inbred rednecks living outside them. The US isn't like that. Iran actually is. The reason for this is that there's a historic split between the mercantile urban elites in the big cities, primarily Tehran and a handful of others, and the rural peasantry, which is tribal, endogamous, heavily into cousin marriage, and there has therefore been breeding itself into stupidity for about 1.4 millennia at this point. And so the part of the political dynamic in Iran is that the mercantile elites are rightly terrified of the mass of stupid peasants out there, because if the stupid peasants ever got angry enough, they would swarm the cities and all the bright mercantile elite people would die horribly. And the ruling elite the religious ruling elite in Iran largely consists of people who are either the handful of bright sparks from the rural peasantry, or people who are willing to use the fear of the pious rural peasantry to keep the merchants in the cities in line. And this is why you have to take the idea of the Iranians nuking the Israelis off the map really seriously. They are led by people who are required to at least to pretend to believe this so hard that at some point they stop pretending, because the uh, the population of the country outside the cities is stupid enough to think nuking Israel is a good idea. The other thing that goes on in Iran that may become relevant soon is that there's a lot more weird diversity there than you might think, because it's a very mountainous country, which means that there are pockets of weird religions and ethno-tribal groups that have survived being pressure from the lowlanders for a very long time. And the best possible example of this is the Zoroastrians. The Zoroastrians are the remnants of the original religion of Iran. Muslims hate Zoroastrians with a burning passion. They call them fire worshippers, and it is a deeply insulting epithet in Islamic parlance. Nevertheless, there are scattered groups of Zoroastrians still living in the Iranian mountains that the dominant Shia Islam has not succeeded in wiping out because it's just too hard. The terrain is too difficult, and exerting force over it is tough. If you live in the cities, you can dominate the coast, and you can dominate a stretch of lowlands bordering the Caspian Sea, but actually completely controlling the interior mountains is really hard. And one of the consequences of this is they have an active Baluchi insurgency over in the east end of the country that they have a continuing problem with, people setting off bombs and killing policemen. Of course, they use this as a justification for repressing the entire rest of the country too, but it's a real problem for them. So because of the urban-rural split and all the weird little tag ends of diehard tribes out in the mountains, Iranian politics is a mess. It is a real mess. It's a mess in a way that's not really imaginable to Americans because, okay, well, if you imagined that America consisted of a coastal strip, two coastal strips, and the entire interior was as rugged as Appalachia and really actually full of stupid inbred hicks, that would be an analogy for Iran. So there is a real threat to Israel. What are the Israelis doing about it? Well, they've just pulled off, they actually managed to top what the Iranians did, what the Ukrainians did to the Russians last week, which takes some doing. I don't know how many of you followed it, but the Ukrainians ran a massive drone strike against critical Russian facilities, including wiping out at least 25% of their strategic bomber fleet, possibly more. Nobody knows. And the interesting thing is the way they did it. They did it with long-range drones, but they also did it with swarms of short-range drones that were launched from truck containers that were trucked to the launch sites by people who did not know what they were carrying. Furthermore, the Ukrainians subverted the Russian cell network to do command and control on their drones. Yes, they used the Russians' own over-the-air wireless network to control their drones because they had so much control of it that they could do that. And the Israelis had done something very similar. A lot of their drone strikes were done from covert positions inside Iran itself, which was necessary because the minimum air distance between Israel and Iran is 2,100 kilometers. That's 1,300 miles for us Americans. You cannot run drone strikes, well, with very few exceptions. There are some very heavy, very high altitude drones that might be able to do it, but nobody has those except the US, as far as we know. It's not a real revealed the Chinese might have some, but it's not a real capability for anybody else. Certainly not for the Israelis, certainly not for the Iranians, certainly not for the Russians, certainly not for the Ukrainians. And so there are some interesting parallels between the Ukrainian operation that killed a bunch of their strategic airplanes, including, this is important, the Russians had at most 6 AWACS planes. That's not what they call them. They call them A-50s. They're forward air controllers with a big radome. Very, very important for offensives against Ukraine, also for air defense. They had 6 of them. They might have 2 left, maybe. The Ukrainians appear to have killed 2 of them, although that's disputed. The Russians claim they killed A-50s that were out of commission. Could be true, not very likely from the aerial photography. Anyway, so an important parallel between these operations illustrates a continuing problem for anybody doing statecraft or geopolitics right now. Borders are really, really porous, and this is a problem. In both cases, the Ukrainians and the Israelis were able to mount operations using sites in the interior of regimes that are police states very heavily into territorial control, exerting, at least attempting to exert much more control over their geography than most countries do. In light of this, we might want to be a bit more concerned about the Red Chinese buying up farmland in the US. There is an actual prompt threat that this could be used for interior operations against US targets, overcoming the problem that there's bimpty bump 1,000 miles of ocean between us and them. So this is one of the things you should walk away from. People who are being paranoid about the Chinese buying farmland, they're not being paranoid. It's a real threat. It's an actual problem. Okay, so borders are porous. This is a problem. Let's talk about some other things. Drones are a big deal. Drones are a big deal because of a problem that military planners and wargamers call the shot exchange problem. It does you very little good in the long run to be able to have a defense against the enemy's offense if the defense is much more expensive than the offense. We have just seen a situation where the Israelis were able to use $50,000 drones, short-range drones, to take out airframes that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars each if the Russians were still capable of building them all, which they aren't. They've lost the capability. This is one of the reasons this is such a heavy blow at the moment. The Russians are going into negotiations with the Ukrainians and the US looking on. And what the Ukrainians have just said to them is, do not think we have no cards left to play. We can destroy your capability as a nuclear power. And why is that a threat? Well, you might think there are missiles and submarines. There are missiles in Siberia. Yes, there are. Let's talk about Russian maintenance standards. This is another very geopolitically relevant thing. Nukes are very difficult and expensive to keep in an operating condition. Very, very difficult. They involve precision machinery, the knowledge of which how to build was almost lost once already in the US. And if we had trouble maintaining the institutional knowledge to run those machines, imagine what it must be like for a country with a lower wealth and technology level. There is a substantial possibility that most of Russia's missiles won't fire. I'm not being a cockeyed optimist about this. I'm thinking about this the way an actual counterforce military planner would. You have to do realistic assessments of threats. It is quite probable that the Russians don't know how many operational missiles they have. And it's probable that they know that they don't know how many operational missiles they have. And in this context, the ability of the Ukrainians to magic up a drone strike out of nowhere and wipe out a substantial portion of their declared nuclear capability is a very serious thing to take into peace negotiations. So, I've come to the end of the. I had a list of bullet points in my head that I was going to walk through. We should talk about Taiwan. This is the other couple of bullet points I want to get through before I open the floor to questions. There are a couple of things that constrain a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in important ways. One is that there are only 2 windows per year where the weather conditions permit fleet actions across the Taiwan Straits. There's a spring window and there's a fall window, and they only last about 6 weeks each. Also, the kind of massing of ships that you have to do to run a cross straits invasion has signs that are unmistakable by satellite. The Chinese, in order to do this, they would have to start doing massive movements of landing craft and escort craft well in advance to coastal muster points. And it would have to be pretty far in advance. Like they'd have to start 3 months in advance of the particular 6-week window that they picked. So one of the constraints on the invasion is we will know when they are going to attempt it. We will have at least 2 months notice, and we will be able to narrow down the window to probably one of two 6-week periods in a particular year or in overlapping 2 years. So that's a constraint on the Chinese. Another constraint on the Chinese is the terrain of Taiwan, which can be described in 2 words. I'm going to say 2 words and a phrase: mountains, jungle, and mountainous jungle. Yes, there are some coastal plains in Taiwan, but you can't control the country by holding the coastal plains. In particular, the capital, Taipei, is located in mountainous jungle, which means, and this is a problem because mountainous jungle is terrain that heavily favors defenders with local knowledge. There's lots of cover, there's lots of concealment, there's lots of rocks to hide behind. Oh, and those coastal plains, there's mountains nearby. If you are betting against, and there are only like 3 plausible invasion beach sites on the whole island. One on the, there's a handy map over here. Direct your attention to the map. I'm going to wander off camera for a moment. The plausible invasion beaches for the Chinese to actually run something are roughly, they're actually pointed out on the map. They're here, here, and there's one more roughly there. Each of them has mountains nearby, and the mountains have Taiwanese gun and rocket emplacements in them, zeroed in on the landing zones. The first troops to land on those landing zones are going to have a really, really bad day. Unless the Chinese can somehow suppress all those well dug in artillery emplacements and rocket pods and stuff. Furthermore, the Taiwanese appear to have taken some really exotic countermeasures. I've seen some intelligence indicating that if they think an invasion fleet is coming in, they have laid lines for that allow them to pump gas to the sea off the invasion beaches that will literally make the ocean burn. Crazy, but it sounds crazy, but they've been expecting the mainland Chinese to invade them since 1949. They've had a lot of time to make preparations and a lot of time to dig in. So we got mountainous jungle, we got exotic countermeasures against beach invasions, we got dug-in artillery, and that's just the tactical problem. The Chinese also have a strategic problem, which is that they're in a situation which is kind of like a scaled up version of Japan's situation just before World War II. They are not self-sufficient in food, they are not self-sufficient in oil, they are not self-sufficient in energy. Their ability to run an industrial economy is dependent on sea lanes that they do not control. That's a real problem if you plan to run an invasion of a minor country that is protected by major maritime powers. Because here's what's going to happen when the Chinese invade Taiwan. the Straits of Sunda and the Straits of Malacca are going to get blockaded against Chinese shipping. These are two straits at the southern edge of the Indonesian archipelago, um, which are critical choke points for all the food and oil that are traveling from points west in Africa and the Middle East to China. The Chinese need this stuff to survive. They, at the population level they have, they simply cannot stockpile enough to run a long war. So the interesting question is, how are they going to prevent the Americans, the Indians, the Australians, and the Japanese from doing naval interdiction on those sea lanes? It's a really hard problem. I don't know how they plan to solve it. So on the other hand, we keep getting rumblings from inside China that indicate that an invasion might be imminent. Now, what might be going on here is that the military people are telling the political leadership what they want to hear, not what's really true. Japan got itself in that kind of trouble too, in pretty much the same way. So let's see, we've talked about, yeah, that goes through all my bullet points. Now I'm going to open the floor to questions. What would you like to hear more about? What have I said that raises questions in your mind? Let's start the ball rolling. What just happened? Oh, okay.
This spring, I visited France, and one of the parts I stopped at was a Maginot Line fort that
Yeah.
was still in operation.
Yeah.
I imagine that's what a lot of Taiwan's defenses are like, except they're internet connected now.
Uh-huh. Well, that's a good analogy, except, okay, yeah, good. I don't have to repeat the question. It was Mike. That's a good analogy, except that the Taiwanese won't really be dealing with a mobile enemy. Excuse me. They won't really be dealing with a mobile enemy who can go around the forts until the Chinese get off the beaches. The Taiwan doesn't have a hospitable coastline for running invasions. There aren't very many places you can do it. So the Taiwanese have the advantage of knowing where the Chinese have to land. And it's not like the situation in World War II where the Germans can simply end run around the defenses. That's not really possible here. They have to do something that's difficult for military planners to imagine to circumvent that restriction. I mean, and that's different from the Maginot Line situation because people did and could and did imagine mobile warfare. It had been a known possibility since the 1920s. The actual reason France fell over so hard, no, I'm not going to go into that right now. They had a mobile reserve that could have solved the problem, and it wasn't available for stupid reasons.
So going back to like Straits of Malacca, how do you think the Belt and Road initiative from China, as far as all those strategic seaports and trying to get more, I guess, oil and petro pipelines to China from Central Asia all the way to Europe, how does that affect the situation?
The Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt to repair this problem, and if they had enough time, it might succeed. But there are a couple of problems with it. One, okay, let's hit the big one first. One is China's demography problem. Chinese population probably peaked in 2006 and has been falling since. This is a consequence of the one-child policy that they've had in in since 1980. The result is that their population of the population of military-age males they can count on having available at any given time is already beginning to decline. their window for running an invasion of Taiwan is going to close. It's going to close in fairly short order, and it's probably going to close before the Belt and Road Initiative can get around their strategic problem. Yeah, I see another question.
The when you mention Russian maintenance and their technology, yes, it's been decimated from the Ukrainians, but as far as maintenance and it being simpler, can't that be of benefit to them too? Like, um, they're using pneumatic tubes to send messages, which makes it much harder to conduct espionage. And their technology may be simpler, but it can be very effective as well.
Sure, everything has costs and benefits.
If this is a dumb question, forgive me, but going back to Taiwan and China for a minute, are there, do they have any other goals besides ideological as to wanting to take Taiwan? That's the main thing, is my understanding of it. But the other question I have related to that is it possible that their goals have shifted to elimination rather than occupation?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think it's very likely, and there are two reasons I don't think it's very likely. One is they all of their propaganda is about taking back the wayward province, not about eliminating an enemy. That's not the kind of thing you tell your own people if you're preparing them to exterminate the Taiwanese. The other thing that I suspect the Chinese want is they probably believe, and they're not entirely without foundation here. They probably believe that if they control Taiwan, they control the Taiwan semiconductor foundries, and that means they can squeeze the throat of the West by controlling the supply of semiconductors. That's not going to work very well if they've turned Taiwan into a smoking ruin. So those are two reasons I doubt they're thinking in terms of elimination. It can't be ruled out entirely. They are communists after all.
My only concern with that. Okay. My only concern with that is by occupation, given the difficulties that you've laid out, wouldn't they wind up destroying the semiconductor capability in the process of taking Taiwan?
Very likely, yes.
Yeah. So that's why I was wondering if it's possible that their goal shifted to elimination as a means of making reliance greater on sources like them or others instead of Taiwan as far as the West is concerned.
It wouldn't work that way. Nobody's going to rely on the Chinese for semiconductors. It's too obviously a weapon. That's why there are chip fabs being built in Arizona right now.
How has the Hong Kong situation in the post-communist occupation, how has that affected Taiwanese sentiment for reunification?
I can only speculate because I don't pay close attention to Taiwanese politics. It is very likely that it has strengthened the hand of the anti-reunification party. But that's just looking at the logic of the situation. My intelligence sources aren't very good about domestic Taiwanese sentiment. They're better at tracking military equipment. Next question.
Like you said, China is not self-sufficient. Taiwan's really not self-sufficient.
Correct.
So might it be a more effective strategy to blockade Taiwan rather than invade?
Yeah, and that is a possibility that everybody's been considering. Combination of a tight blockade plus political pressure. The problem with that is everybody knows what the end game is. If the Chinese do that, everybody knows what the end game is, and they're going to find themselves in a naval war, whether they want one or not. Because even if an isolationist U.S. administration decided they could tolerate that situation, the Japanese can't. Am I boring everybody that much? Kathy, what's your question?
Speaking of the Japanese, have we seen any unusual activity from them indicating that they're getting ready to be able to make a move if they need to?
Good question. And they have been doing several things that are indicative. One is, let's talk about Japanese helicopter carriers. Somebody already knows this joke. Helicopter carriers. The Japanese nominally do not have aircraft carriers. They have helicopter carriers. The helicopter carriers have elevators for the helicopters that are really big. They're larger than would be strictly necessary for helicopters. By some odd, funny coincidence, they're exactly the right size for an F-35. Wow, what a coincidence. So yeah, the Japanese have been arming up to fight a naval and air war with the Chinese if they have to. They're just keeping the fact that they're doing it close to the kimono. The other thing that they've been doing is they have control of a bunch of small islands that extend southwards towards Taiwan. They have been fortifying the shit out of those. And it's pretty clear that if things go hot in the South China Sea, the Japanese are intending to run missions out of those islands. It puts them like 1,000 miles closer, which is a big deal. Next question. Kathy again. Oh, there's another one.
The other day, Netanyahu. The other day, Netanyahu made a reference to if Israel were to fall, the rest of the world would feel a lot of pain. Do you think he was referencing the Samson option, and what would be the U.S. response to that?
Does everybody know about the Samson option? Okay. Briefing on the Samson option. It is a pretty open secret that the Israelis have nukes. It is a pretty open secret that decades ago, the Israelis went around to the various frontline Arab states and said, we have a limited number of nukes. We have nukes targeted on every one of your capitals. And if Israel falls, your capitals are glass. There's a dead man switch. If Israel falls, your cities are toast. That's called the Samson option. Essentially, the Israelis have said to the frontline nations, there is a certain amount of terrorist bullshit and warfare that we will tolerate from you idiots. But if it ever gets serious, your capitals are glass. That's the Samson option. Everybody knows it's there. The US knows it's there. The Russians knows it's there. Everybody knows it's there. What can we do about it? What would we want to do about it if we could?
Back to the F-135s. Is there any good intelligence as to how many of those Israel might have, or where they might be getting them from?
No, it's not the Israelis that have stealth F-35 elevators. It's the Japanese.
Oh, right. We're back in the
Japanese.
So going back to the Japanese then, sorry.
I don't know how many F-35s the Japanese have, but it's a safe bet they have some.
It's one of those things we won't find out until somebody starts horsing around with the trigger.
It's not generally considered a good use of money to build aircraft carriers for aircraft you don't have. So I think it's a fairly safe bet. They've got some F-35s in their pocket. Next question. Yeah.
Don't they have to train their pilots? And if so, how could this be all that secret?
Well, there ain't nobody doing much monitoring of Japanese airspace except the Japanese and maybe us. You can spot airplane contrails by satellite, but it's not easy to tell one fifth or sixth generation fighter from another. And the Japanese have their own native fighters. They are actually capable of building at least fourth generation, possibly fifth generation fighters themselves. So yeah, it would be pretty easy for the Japanese to conceal that.
So, going back to like the Malacca Straits and those being shut down,
Yeah.
and a potential Chinese-Taiwan conflict. For that, how long do you think the Chinese would last? And with that, I'm kind of picturing like a Japanese basically try to inflict initial damage,
Right.
and then see how far they can push it.
Yeah.
Before the U.S. or other powers can respond.
Well, what they're gonna do their damnedest to try and keep the U.S. out of the war. There are lots of ways they could exert pressure to do that. One is political. They have a lot of agents in the U.S. It's not. You may think it's just paranoid right wingers saying that, but no, it's true. They have a lot of agents in the U.S. They had a spy fucking one of our senators, for Christ's sakes. This is public information. That's only the one you know about. Tim Waltz is a Chinese operative. It's pretty obvious. You don't take high school students over to China for decades using money from where? Uh, Unless the Chinese own you. So yeah, we're penetrated that way. They could exert political pressure. They've got covert networks. If worst comes to worst, they might have the capability to launch domestic terrorist operations from bases in the U.S. That's why the buying farmland bit is a bit worrying. I don't have any hard intelligence that they can do that, but everybody who knows the way the Chinese think about strategy is a little worried about this because they love indirection. They really pay attention to all the Sun Tzu stuff about attacking the enemy not where he's strong but where he's weak. So they will try to keep the U.S. out of the war, but there's a problem. They have another rival who is also who's bitterly opposed to them, and is also capable of blockading the Malacca and Sunda Straits. In fact, for some reasons, in some ways, it would be easier for them than it would be for us because they're the Indians, and their logistics tail to maintain that blockade is a lot shorter than it is for us. The closest naval base we have is, I'm not actually sure, but India is probably closer. So, even if they keep the U.S. out of the war, how are they going to keep the Indians out? Threaten to nuke Indian cities? Yeah.
So when the Ukraine-Russia conflict started off, India thought it was fine and continued buying cheap Russian oil. Do you think, what makes you think that they would be a lot more opposed to the Chinese and Taiwan?
Because Russia isn't a direct geopolitical rival of India, but China is. They actually have border disputes. They've had border disputes that both of them take rather seriously. And that's not, have you ever heard of an India-Russia border dispute? There isn't one. So that's the direct answer. The Indians and the Chinese see themselves as direct rivals over border disputes, over regional hegemony, and over standing as a great power. Next.
Is the Three Gorges Dam as much of a sort of a weak spot as people online make it out to be for China?
Oh, yes, it is. Pretty good chance that somebody, probably several somebodies, has nuclear missiles targeted on the Three Gorges Dam, and if things go really bad, I mean, it wouldn't even take a nuke. You drop enough fuel air explosives on that dam, it's going to crack. And pretty certainly that dam is targeted and it's dialed in. And if things go hot, Chinese air defenses better be really good. Because you know what happens if the Three Gorges Dam goes out? Is everybody aware of this risk? Central China gets flooded out, the most productive part of the country, several major cities. They go bye-bye. It would be, what was that?
And they lose a lot of electricity.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, the Three Gorges Dam is a serious vulnerability. I don't know that the Taiwanese, and this is something I've been trying to find out, I haven't succeeded. I don't know that the Taiwanese have any weapons that are capable of busting it, but several of their allies do. Next question.
I'm going to slightly take it in. Well, actually, I'm going to just definitely take it into a little bit of a different direction, different
Okay.
country. With Iran, do you think it's because every so often they raise their heads, they cause a little ruckus, cause a big ruckus, then they go away. Do you think that this is going to be something that's like a rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat? And do you ever foresee that the current government is going to get toppled?
Those are two separate questions, and I will try to address them. So you've pointed out that the Iranians have a history of sponsoring episodic terrorism, followed by pulling their head back into their shell. Part of this is due to the nature of the tools they have to use. Iran is not a major military power. It would be difficult for them to invade their neighbors even if they wanted to. And the Iranian geography is part of the reason. It's tough enough to move troops through Iran itself, let alone get from Iran to its neighbors. Iran is not a major military power. That means that they have tended to work through proxies that are recruited on the ground where they want to exert pressure. Of these, the one that's most hand in glove with them is Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah has not been having a good year. Ever since what was the hilarious name for the pager strike? I'm not remembering it. Anyway, ever since the pager strike, Hezbollah has not been having a good year. It's been decapitated. It's trying to reconstitute itself. But right now, it is not an effective way for the Iranians to exert pressure on anybody. There's also Hamas. They can work through Hamas to an extent, but they're also limited there because Hamas is not an Iranian creation. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is a Sunni organization rather than a Shia one. They have serious differences with the Iranians. They do not buy into the whole crazy millenarian 12er ideology that the Iranians do. The thing that networks the Hamas and the Iranians together is basically they both want to wipe out Israel, and I'm not being metaphorical. They want to kill every single Jew in Israel. That is their objective. They want to commit genocide. That common desire for genocide is what holds Hamas and the Iranians together. But that means that other than actions against the Israelis, the Iranians can't really use Hamas for anything else. They're a limited applicability tool. And our third group of crappy barbarians that the Iranians can exert some influence over is the Houthi. They're actually capable of being more irritating to the civilized world than anybody else because they can interdict shipping in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Which in fact they have been doing, and there's a naval operation going on there now in an attempt to to stop that from happening. So the Houthis are busily getting pasted by American munitions and various European countries have thrown, and Israeli munitions, and various European countries are throwing in their bit too. But that war is complicated for another reason, which is related to the shot exchange problem I talked about earlier. The Houthis are using cheap weapons against our expensive ones, and that carries certain problems with it in its wake. So episodic terrorism is due primarily to the fact that the Iranians have few direct levers. They have to work through proxies. Their proxies are unreliable, and some of their proxies have not been having a good time lately. Whether there's a prospect for regime change, I've told you almost as much as I know about Iranian domestic politics. Beyond that, it's pretty opaque. It's not clear who the factions are. There are people who used to think they knew who the factions were in Iranian politics, but it turned out they were wrong, and the factions were actually simulations created by the Iranians themselves to manipulate Westerners. So we can't count on knowing who the factions are because the Iranians are very good at that game. They've demonstrated it before. So stability of the Iranian government, I can't even give you a guess. They could fall tomorrow. They could endure for another 30 years. Nobody can say. And anybody who claims to be able to tell you with great confidence is probably full of shit. Is that the kind of answer you were looking for? Yes. Okay. Next question.
The Iranians and Hamas. So that tenuous relationship you were speaking about a moment ago, do you think that Hamas didn't count on it going as far as it did in Palestine, and Iran was just hoping to use them to win this PR war for hearts and minds?
I don't know, and I don't think it matters. There's a certain point past which trying to second guess the intentions of people like the Hamas and the Iranians is really kind of pointless. You can wind yourself up in all kinds of complications trying to second guess what they believe and what they will do on the basis of what they believe. And intelligence analysts know this, and so generally, unless their political masters demand it, they don't go by what they think the opposition wants to do. They go by what it has the capability to do. Because capabilities are easier to assess than intentions. So that's why throughout this briefing, I've been talking about what the various parties can do and what the constraints on their abilities are. You notice I haven't talked much about what they want? That's because, in general, smart intelligence analysts try to avoid that conversation. They know it doesn't tend to lead good places or useful places. Next question. I saw this gentleman over here wanted to ask something.
This is a bit of a departure from direct politics.
Yeah.
But do you have an opinion on the relative strengths of our F-35 and Raptors versus what other powers, namely, I guess most credibly China, but also I think Russia tried this for a minute, what they claim are Generation 5 fighters that they claim are on par with the F-35?
Okay, I can say a few things about this. The Russian Air Force is a joke. They are not serious opposition. The only thing that makes Russia a serious military threat at this point is nukes that they may not have. Their Air Force is so much of a joke that they haven't been able to achieve uncontested air superiority against the Ukrainians. Think about that for a bit. So yeah, forget the Russian Air Force. It's not really a player, except maybe for their strategic bombers that they don't have very many of anymore. But yeah, as far as Russian fighters going against American ones, the correct response is ha, ha, ha. They they probably don't have anything that comes close to matching the F-35, and they certainly don't have anything that can match the F-22, which would be more reassuring if Obama hadn't scrapped all the F-22 tooling. But we still have the planes. The Chinese are a much more complicated question. There are optimistic scenarios and there are pessimistic scenarios. The pessimistic scenario says that the Chinese are abreast or slightly ahead of us in building state-of-the-art fighters. The pessimistic scenario says the Chinese are really good at propaganda, and they don't have anything nearly that good. We used to believe that the Russians were at parity with us in fighters. They never were. Never, ever, during the entire history of the Soviet Union, were they at parity with US fighter capacity. They were very good at making us think they were. We built entire generations of state-of-the-art fighters in response to beliefs about Russian technology, technological advancement that were completely false. We may be in the same situation with the Chinese right now. Nobody knows. Nobody knows for sure.
That's fair enough. Thank you.
As far as vulnerabilities to infrastructure, I know there are several attacks on U.S. infrastructure on a regular basis from an infrastructure standpoint. How does the Chinese and I guess the Iranians as well, how, I guess, vulnerable are they in comparison to us?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, the Chinese have the Iranians rather, have one really serious single point vulnerability that nobody's exploited yet. I think the Israelis and maybe us are holding that card in reserve, kind of waving it at the Iranians going, you won't like where this goes if it gets any nastier. And that single point vulnerability is called Karg Island. Does that name mean anything to anybody? It's an island the Iranians own. It holds their oil refinery. Their only oil refinery. Do I need to draw a picture? Oil refineries really like to go explodey when you drop explosives on them. So the Iranians have a really serious single point vulnerability. I can't think of a corresponding one for the Chinese unless you want to include Three Gorges. How would you exclude Three Gorges? Well, it's a harder target than an oil refinery. The question was, how can you exclude Three Gorges? It's a harder target than an oil refinery. Oil refineries are really easy to take out. They want to catch on fire and burn down. Three Gorges is a big freaking dam. It doesn't want to catch on fire and burn down. There's a lot of concrete there, a lot of mass, a lot of inertia. Take a lot more work to destroy that. Okay, next question.
So I noticed you haven't said anything about cyber warfare for any of these countries. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Yes. Let's talk about that a little. This is actually a little closer to the geek side of my life. Well, the first geopolitical problem the U.S. has with respect to cyber warfare is that we're horribly vulnerable. I know people, credible people who I've known for many years. I've carefully not asked them why they believe this, but I know people who have told me that if they chose, they could pick any given segment, any given area of the U.S. internet, and then take it down hard at will. I even think I know how they do it, and I'm not going to speculate out loud because it's dangerous knowledge. We're horribly vulnerable. The internet was designed to recover from catastrophes, but it wasn't designed to be invulnerable to them. And we are now sufficiently dependent on it that economic losses would be pretty serious if somebody took down large passages of the US internet. And there's vulnerabilities due to crappy firmware. And I probably don't have to explain this to most of the people in this room. So we are very vulnerable. I wish more was being done about it. I don't know how our vulnerability compares to China or Iran's. They're probably running the same crappy firmware we are, so they're just as vulnerable. The question is, who is targeting them? I am, as far as cyber warfare threats go, I'm not very worried about the Iranians. They do not have the kind of culture that produces expert crackers. I'm worried about the mainland Chinese. They do have the kind of culture that can produce those people. And there have been scattered bits of evidence of the Chinese trying to play very long games with U.S. infrastructure. One that kind of gave me chills was there is evidence that the Chinese ran an attack that attempted to break the Merkle chain and corrupt Google's repositories. And this is why Google is, well, they didn't have a Merkle chain at the time. This is why Google isn't using Perforce anymore, because the Chinese demonstrated the ability to corrupt Perforce repositories. Now they're using Git that has an actual Merkle chain. It's much more difficult to screw with that. So there's evidence that also there was what's that? There was a recent bug that the Chinese were probably running. It was the one that it was the SSH vulnerability due to a flaw in a compression library. I don't remember the name for it, but this is more recent. That if we can trust the few indications we have, that one was probably run by an ethnic Chinese living in Indonesia. But the odds that he was working for the mainland Chinese are very high indeed. That's exactly the kind of attack they like to run. So I'm more worried about the Chinese than anybody else. Yeah.
There's also the evidence of communication chips being inserted into solar charge controllers. Now, they may
I
be
did not know about that one.
Yeah, cellular communication chips in charge controllers. Why would you? Who? Nobody volunteered to have that in their charge controller. And the question is, if these things are all pre-equipped with SIM cards, all the Chinese have to do is say, okay, register all these SIMs. Okay, now turn them all off.
Yeah. Next question.
Well, we hadn't spoke about the.
Oh, wait, it's 3:07. This better be the last one.
Okay, I'll make it quick. We hadn't talked about the North Korean jet, and I was watching this video the other day about how a smartphone had been smuggled out of North Korea, and it looked pretty good. And their autocorrect dictionary it would correct South Korean slang back into what the North Koreans wanted it to be. And I know you mentioned intentions and all that, but why would the North Koreans allow anybody to have a smartphone in their country, especially when it's probably only the elite that have them, when we could so easily hack those things, you know?
I don't know, and why do I care? What's the geopolitical threat here?
Well, we could take advantage of it. We could take advantage of it easily. It's a threat for them.
Maybe, but that goes beyond what I would have speculated about.
You are scheduled for an hour and 45 minutes.
Oh, am I?
Yes.
Okay, we have more time then.
You have another 40 minutes to go.
Okay, very good. I can take more questions.
So to piggyback on that, I would think that it would be just the fact that there's that, how many elites there are versus, versus the people who don't have the access to the smartphone and things like that. And then also, there's always the saying of also, follow what's there to gain and such. So that's kind of where my mind is going. As far as domestically, and I am not trying to make anybody groan here, and I apologize. What would you say domestically is the current, besides Chinese, the current threat to us right now at this point?
Communists, same as it's always been. They're running an insurrection in Los Angeles right now. Next question.
Hey, thank you, sir. Yeah, quick question from earlier when you were talking about Israel and their Samson plan. You said that was pre-targeted nuclear weapons to capitals and nations surrounding Israel.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm wondering, would that potentially target U.S. allies as well, or would this be something to say, hey, please go help us in our fight against Iran, otherwise we'll hurt some of your interest? Or I guess what would be the end game there?
Yes, they almost certainly have missiles targeting U.S. allies in the region, because the goal of the Samson option is to make it is not just to frighten the bad actors, but to put pressure on the good actors to keep the bad actors in line rather. So yeah, they doubtless have a missile targeted on Amman, despite the fact that Jordan is in some sneaky ways almost an Israeli ally. But they've got a missile targeted there. They got one targeted on Ankara. They got one targeted on Riyadh, and another one targeted on Mecca, because the power dynamic here is there is a certain point past which not only must you not push us, you must not tolerate anyone else pushing us. Next question.
So I think we all often hear how Chinese and North Korean have offensive like strikes and programs that they target in the West and in the U.S. But the U.S. has a very great tradition of hackers as well. So how often, how active do you think like the NSA or the CIA or whatever our offensive cyber programs are? How active do you believe they are in China offensively?
I have no data.
Gotcha.
There's only a very limited extent to which I'm willing to speculate beyond the intelligence I have available, and that is an area in which I have no data.
We've had a nice little discussion about things going on in Asia, particularly near China. but I would like to hear a little bit of an update about what's going on between Russia and the Ukraine since President Trump decided to play hardball with Zelensky.
Well, yeah, that was last week.
Right.
This week, Trump is pissed off at Putin for obvious and good reasons. Right now, the war is in what's essentially a political stall. Both sides are going into negotiations. The Ukrainians have done something to strengthen their hand. See, the thing is, you want me to talk about intentions, and I don't want to do that.
I did not know, in
yeah.
fact, because I've heard almost nothing since Trump started leaning on both sides, really.
You're asking me to talk about intentions and beliefs, and I would, for reasons I've talked about, I would rather not do that.
So in other words, there is no specifically military data at this point. We're all in negotiation mode, which means it's intentions and beliefs all the way down until something happens.
You know, if you don't count them blowing up 25% of the Russian strategic bomber fleet, that's a hard datum.
Oh, I agree. I agree. It's just that I don't know if anything has happened since, and I guess the answer is no.
Well, there's been a Russian counterstrike. They're doing their usual shit, throwing missiles at cities that aren't military targets.
That's the only thing they don't seem to run out of, missiles.
No, actually, if you plot the long-term curves, they are running out, but it's happening slowly.
So it's the thing they'll run out of last.
Yeah, they can still do these big strikes occasionally, but if you look at the spacing, the interval between the strikes is getting longer and longer and longer. And you know, the clear signature of a resource that they have to conserve because they're running out of it.
Right. Thank you. That was as much as I could expect to hope for.
Yeah.
Two more. Speaking of Russian resources, how are they doing on personnel, you think? They got the infusion from the North Koreans, but how long will their own troops and the North Korean troops last?
I'm not sure. Oh, you mean the North Korean troops fighting for the Russians? Yes. They may all be dead already. There were a flurry of sightings and some evidence of battlefield activity, but I don't think there have been any confirmed sightings of North Koreans on the battlefield in at least a month and a half. So it's possible they're all dead or hiding.
So I know during the Russian war, we've dealt with a couple incidents of like hacktivism in the open source community.
Yeah.
I guess how much bigger of a threat would it be if we were in a war with China on the open source community?
Don't know enough to speculate. There are some things we know about Chinese capabilities and some things we don't know. And, you know, ask me about fighters and invasion routes. Those questions I can answer. Ask me what the Chinese might be able to do to our tribe. I'm afraid I don't know that.
Yes, sir. I read this morning that Iranian General Samir Hayati said that they have over 6 million short-range drones aimed at key Israeli targets. Is that just a bluff? I mean, surely you can't have more than a few 100,000 at best. They don't have that kind of capability.
6 million does sound implausibly high. They would have, I mean, given their manufacturing capacity, they could have 6 million drones if they'd been stockpiling them long enough. But they probably haven't been because, among other things, we know that they've been selling them to the Russians at fairly high volume. So I think I'd mark that one down as possible, but quite unlikely.
Is it possible that that's just a very distasteful historical reference?
Yeah, that's possible too.
That did sound familiar.
The Iranians are also claiming that Israel didn't do any damage to their nuclear program because they're so deep under the earth. Don't they have our bunker busters? Do you think the Iranians are just lying?
I don't think the Israelis would have put together strike packages against the Iranian nuclear program unless they've had pretty good reason to believe that the strike packages would do more than raise some dust. So I think the scale of the operation is evidence that the Israelis believe that their weapons are capable of killing Iranian deep bunkers. So that's datum one. Datum two, so on the negative side, I'll say that none of my intelligence makes it certain that the Israelis have those weapons. On the other hand, they aren't hard to build. And once fuel air explosives are not complicated. I mean, it's not something you need like $1 million AI to construct. So, so the 3 points are the Israelis evidently believe they can do damage. We don't know that we have those weapons, but the weapons are sufficiently easy to construct that it would be surprising if the Israelis didn't have them. I'm not sure I have a better answer than that. Next. Since until somebody else thinks up a question, there's something else I was going to talk about for a few minutes, which is how to evaluate intelligence and how to think like an intelligence analyst. I am not a professional intelligence analyst. I merely listen very carefully to people who are, and I've read some of the things that they use to train intelligence analysts. So let's talk about the world from the point of view of an intelligence analyst. I've already touched on one of the big things, which is instead of, as much as possible, stay away from intentions and think about capabilities and assume that adversaries will do what they are capable of. Because historically, when you have a capable adversary, it has proven to be an extremely dangerous and often terminal mistake to assume that they don't intend to use that capability. So that's point one about thinking like an intelligence analyst. Think about capabilities, not intentions. Another point about thinking like an intelligence analyst is how do you evaluate your sources? How do you assign a likelihood that this person or this organization is telling the truth score to use in your scenario construction? And the answer is very simple, but it's annoyingly difficult unless you've been doing it for a while. The only way you can do this is to track the predictive accuracy of the source's statements over time. So you keep track of what they said in the past and whether it had the consequences you would expect if that statement, the observable consequences you would expect if that statement were truthful. So you need to keep a running tally of what various sources are saying and a running tally of the predictive accuracy of their past claims, which you often can't know until sometime after they make them. But if you do this for long enough, you start to get baselines. You start to notice who's consistently truthful, who consistently lies, who is all over the map and may be confused about either as a product of lying or as a product of simple confusion. Don't underestimate the power of the latter. And you can start to make generalizations. One of the ones that's relevant to the current geopolitical situation, and I'm going to talk about the reason for this too. The Ukrainians tell the expected tactical lies to deceive their opponents. But broadly, the Ukrainians are remarkably truthful. And it's not hard to understand why. Because they are critically dependent on support from the US and other Western countries. And they can't keep that support if they they get a reputation for telling the bad kind of lie, the kind of lie that deceives their allies as opposed to their enemies. So you can, after a while, you can notice that the Ukrainians are a lot more truthful than the Russians are. Doesn't mean the Russians don't say true things sometimes, but when you're keeping a running tally and you're constructing scenarios and trying to sum up information from a whole bunch of sources of varying reliability, you're going to weight the Ukrainians higher than the Russians because they have a better history. Okay, that's basic number 2 about thinking like an intelligence analyst. So we've had think in terms of capabilities rather than intentions, and evaluate sources by looking at their predictive history. You know, I'm not sure there's a third major point. If you can do both of those things and then you just pay attention to a lot of sources, you will start learning things. You will even start learning things from propaganda. You'll even start learning things from sources that are intended to be deceptive. Because what your enemy wants you to believe is an important signal too. So, okay, I'll go back to taking questions. Yes.
To answer previous thing about bunker busters, I did hear that the Israelis destroyed a site that was buried, but was maybe only like 10 meters or so below ground. But their most important sites are deep within mountains that you might be able to destroy at entrance, but only one of the entrances, even if you knew about them all.
Yeah. There are lots of unknowns here. But we do know that the Israelis, who are not stupid, are behaving like they think they can take out the Iranian nuclear program. Is that something is that a bluff anyone would run in the Israel situation? You have to ask yourself, why would they put together that strike package if they didn't think it would be effective? Now, they could be wrong. It could be that their weapons don't have the capabilities that they were expecting, but it's still a pretty heavy datum that they put together the strike at all. Okay, now let's talk, okay, but that brings up an interesting point. There are some countries that would do that despite the fact that their weapons are complete bullshit and can't accomplish what they think they can accomplish. You expect that kind of behavior from countries that have authoritarian societies where lying about your capabilities is a ubiquitous survival tactic. Russia is like that. China is like that. Israel isn't like that. Internally, they can afford to be truthful because it's not suicide to be truthful in the Israeli system. In the Russian system, in the Chinese system, it can be literal suicide to be truthful. So everybody lies all the time. And the result is, oh yeah, I should have talked about this sooner. This is a principle I learned from studying a wacky religion called Discordianism before I was seriously into intelligence analysis. Discordians noticed a long time ago that in authoritarian organizations, there's a progressive disconnect between what the people at the bottom know and can do and what the people at the top decide. And the reason is because in a hierarchy like that, you are rewarded for telling your bosses what you want to hear more consistently than you're rewarded for telling the truth. This is also true in large corporations that are organized along authoritarian lines. It's not only a problem with governments, but in any authoritarian hierarchy, you get a progressive disconnect because the information flowing to the decision makers is more and more corrupted by the internal incentives of the system itself. Eventually, a system like this goes functionally insane. the decision makers are incapable of making good decisions because they can't get the data to do it. The possibility that they could get the data to do it was destroyed long ago by the fact that it's dangerous to tell the truth. This is why Russia thought it had the second best army in the world and now seems to have the second best army in Ukraine. Although there's still more of it, which is a problem. But since you brought that up, I want to highlight the difference between what it's like to be an Israeli decision maker planning a strike against Iran and what it's like to be what it's like to be Vladimir Putin planning an invasion of Ukraine. Netanyahu can mostly count on his military people to help to tell him the truth about what their weapons are capable of. I mean, there's bullshit in every command system. It's unavoidable. There's a certain percentage of it, but in a system like the Israeli one, the percentage is small, and it doesn't dominate. In a system like the Russian or the Chinese one, or the Iranian one for that matter, the percentage of bullshit is very large because truth telling is extremely dangerous. So yeah, that was an important point to bring out. I see a question.
We've seen in the last week and some two fairly closed societies invaded by their opponents. Ukraine bringing the drones in the containers, and Israel, Mossad, actually setting up.
Yeah, I think you weren't here. You weren't here when I talked about this. Yeah.
No, I wasn't. But so then the question becomes, if this can be done in closed societies like Russia and Iran, what kind of threat are we facing?
You should have been here for the first part of my talk.
Well, I'm sorry, I wasn't.
I'm not going to repeat myself. Sorry. Next question.
What do you think about recently the change with Starlink? When we're talking about Starlink, the intelligence that we used here with Starlink, but now that Starlink has changed sides, what do you think can that cause a problem for us?
What do you mean by changed sides?
Well, intelligence. We went from the G7 to the BRICS. So we're dealing with one side on the BRICS side. Well, once Starlink was ally of G7, but now Starlink has changed sides and became an ally with the BRICS nations.
I know of no evidence that that's true.
Okay, just asking. Okay.
Are you referring to like Elon Musk having to dust up with the Ukrainians and not wanting to let them use his technology anymore? Yeah. So Elon having a temper tantrum will affect Ukrainians' ability to have communications. I think that's what she's getting at.
Right, but expanding that to Starlink being a tool of the BRICS is ridiculous. A temper tantrum does not a geopolitical alignment make. Eventually, Elon comes down off the weed or the ketamine or whatever. What was that? It can.
I'm not sure if you answered this in the earlier part of your talk, but I was going to ask, how far is the U.S. willing to defend Israel, do you believe? Or
I don't know, and I don't like to talk about intentions.
Gotcha.
Were you here when I was going on about that? Okay. To go over this point again, smart intelligence analysts try to avoid basing a lot of scenario planning on what they think the enemy's intentions might be. It's not a good idea. Too many people have seen that opponents have a dangerous capability and said, oh, no, they'll never use it. We think they know their intentions. That's a great way to get in a war that you lose. So intelligence analysts have learned not to do that. Yes.
The right side of your frame, right side of your frame up there shows where Chinese did drills. Are those all opposite the beaches that they think they might use?
Two of them are. That one far off to the north, as far as I know, there's no invasion beach there. You see three of them on the map. The second and third one down, those are both opposite invasion beaches, and there's one invasion beach that doesn't have an arrow on it. The one to the north of the island, as far as I know, there's no invasion beach there. Next question. Well, I guess maybe we're done then. Okay, I see one more.
As far as China and their man-made islands in the South China Sea, and I know a lot of that is for power projection and maintaining shipping lanes.
Yeah.
How effective do you think that is going to be in a potential war with Taiwan?
Let me just say the word target. It's a big, fat, stationary target. I'm not worried about those islands. So I guess we're wrapping it up. Thank you for listening, and thank you for asking interesting questions.